Hello, I am James Butler of Novara Media, and I have the great pleasure of sitting here with Anthony Barnett, who, of course, many of you will know. Anthony was a founder of openDemocracy, now going strength to strength. They are indeed sitting in their offices right now. Also deeply involved in Charter 88, key movement for constitutional change and constitutional reform from the left in Britain. And I think one of our key constitutional thinkers as well. I think that's a fair way to put it. And I guess one of the things I wanted to sort of talk to you about today was this rather difficult sense at the moment, more I think than any point in my lifetime, or certainly my adult political lifetime, the question of the Constitution is on people's minds and on people's lips. And it seems to me, I don't know what you make about it. It seems to me that politically active people on the left think about the Constitution rarely, if at all, and then really only in moments of crisis. Is that fair?
In England?
Yeah, in England.
Yeah, as you know. Yeah.
Is that fair?
No, I think it's very generous of you to put it like that. I think the left here is trapped in the British state and the framework of the British state, and a kind of repression has taken place. Not just that they don't think about it, but there's a way in which people refuse to think about it, and that this refusal is profoundly disabling of any radical program.
And I think
it has very deep. It's deeply rooted in all the things that they think they're better than. We're not bourgeois, and we're above all this stuff, and actually it's got them by the throat.
It's odd, isn't it? Because there is this tradition in sort of continental political thought. You have the inheritance of Jacobinism, you have the inheritance of radical Republican traditions. Whereas in Britain you have really the inheritance of what is essentially an aristocratic coup d'etat in 1688, and then an odd sort of ambling along. You get the increase in the franchise. You get sort of universal suffrage eventually. But there doesn't seem to me, you have dribs and drabs of articulations of the way in which things might be different, but they end up incorporated into the British state, especially. And I know you've sort of worked extensively on, or thought a great deal about that relationship between the plurinational state and Britishness. Is Britishness the obstacle here?
Well, it's more. I mean, I think the crucial thing is that a repression is taking place, and I think the description of the inheritance that we've got in 1688 is both unfair to 1688 in a way, which was the first modern revolution, wasn't just an aristocratic coup, and was also unfair to the 19th century when the Constitution was a really live issue that people believed in. They wouldn't dreamt of saying, well, we don't have a Constitution. They felt they had a really good one. It was one of the reasons why England in particular, Bagehot wrote a book called The English Constitution, was the world's #1 power. So there was a political framework that they believed in. And what's happening now, very, very strongly, is that, and Brexit is an expression of this, is the collapse of a political framework that we could believe in. And one of the ways in which the left has gone along with this process, so well, to put it like this, it's a rather good book by Ferdinand Mount. After we started Charter 88, that people said, well, the Constitution is important. He wrote a book called The Constitution Now. And he demonstrated that until the Fabians, until, if you like, the First World War and the Fabian administrative state got their hands on the Constitution, it was an issue of great passion from Maitland, Coleridge. Can you imagine a poet now writing a book about the Constitution, right? As if, but for Coleridge it was a Christian constitution, and he wrote a whole book about that. So, and that sense of we know best, leave it to us. This is a technical issue, and that the technicization of the Constitution was a way in which what was left of the post-imperial ruling framework retained control of the framework as they had to allow full franchise, which only came in the 1920s, and the unwashed got the vote, but they didn't get to believe in the country that was ruling them.
Right. So in a sense, your reading here of the progression is that you have, effectively, the dominant wing of the Labour Party at the time, the early 20th century. I think sort of Fabianism is more or less the kind of intellectual core there, and their attitude to this is actually not one of kind of constitutional change, but actually a kind of series of instruments that can be taken over.
There's a form of, if you like, if you think of the classic trade union movement, it on the one hand is an expression of the interests of the working class, and on the other hand it's a form of discipline which is very anti-democratic in its culture and in its framework and its style. It isn't Leninist in its undemocratic way, but it's certainly centralist. That's that complex that we can call labourism. And it, within that, it basically said, we will look after your welfare, but you leave democracy, don't worry about it. So to take a recent example of this, I mean, relatively recent, over the last 30 years, since Charter 88, I've been saying, look, people like agency, these issues of what kind of country we are matter, and I've been told time and again, especially by Labour politicians, it doesn't work in the doorstep. Come to the doorstep, they're interested in pothole. People they're not interested in these issues. Well done, jolly good, we like what you say, but people don't care about it. And then 17.4 million people vote to take back control. Right? And that is a constitutional claim. Of course, it's an inarticulated cry of rage because the necessary constitutional democratic language has been taken away from us. But it's been taken away from us by our side, who was unable to take those issues forward. And you can see it now in the tragedy, inexplicable tragedy to me, of Corbynism. Because, sorry if I'm racing ahead, right? But so Corbyn is was a Bennite. He was a follower. He was Tony Benn's sort of bag carrier. And one of the things about Benn and his radicalism was that although he was a quite traditional British politician, he was for the Union, he was against PR, and he was against the European Union, he nonetheless energized people in terms of self-government. Who are we? How do you throw us out? All of this sort of thing. And he wrote a constitution. He wrote a model constitution. So he was very much in favour of, he was for, at one point where we agreed, I think we may both be mistaken, but we both supported having a referendum on the European Union. I mean, we did a discussion once, about the levellers, and he was very struck because he thought I was pro-European. He was very suspicious of me. He thought I was sort of centrist. And when I said I was for a referendum, he said, okay, we can talk, right? So he was a Democrat. And that element simply isn't there in Corbynism. And we've tried time and again lobbying Trickett and John Trickett, who holds the Constitutional Convention brief, and other people, members of the Labour Party, I'm not a member of any political party, to say, what response you have to Brexit, you've got to unleash people's democratic energy. They want to feel in some way that they're agents. And we're being told that, the poverty, the food banks, the economy, all these, ending austerity, wonderful, right? But not attached to that sense. And therefore, to race right forward to today, you've got the deeply cynical Johnson figures and Farage figures saying, get it done, we will deliver for you, you are the masters, we are the servants. And put the hypocrisy on one side, for the regular person, they're offering a degree of political agency. And unless we can do that, we're lost.
Right, I mean, this is there are several things I want to pick up there, but the one, just on that in terms of the Labour Party's orientation to this stuff, obviously there's a sort of long story here, and I was reading recently actually Richard Crossman's preface to his edition of Badger.
Right.
Crossman was a Labour peer, very interested in these questions. And he talks about the way in which actually in some ways...
Didn't he ever become a peer?
Did he not become a peer? No, he was
Minister of...
NEC, and yes, yeah, you're right. No, I was thinking, yes.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway,
I'll tell you a story about Crossman, but that's another matter, right?
But one of the things he was saying is that the way in which the Labour Party forges itself is in some ways sort of, it mirrors the British Constitution in some ways, right? It gives this semblance of democratic control to its members, while also sort of keeping a sort of technified autonomy of its sort of leadership and in a sense its kind of governing class. And so it doesn't surprise me in some sense that the Labour Party finds it very difficult to figure out how to put these two issues together. But I suppose I'm sympathetic, in some ways to the quandary the Labour politicians find themselves in, which I think is answerable, which is the way in which you connect that question, because in some ways it's a question about economic democracy in one sense, right? Do you own the things in your life that allow you to sustain yourself? Do you have ownership over whether you have a pothole in the road and when your bins are collected and things like that? And I think it can be and should be connected to a question of democratic ownership and your ownership over how you're governed. And I think you're quite right that that's the appeal being made by Farage and by Johnson, saying that there is a democratic impulse here. But it seems, it's curious to me that those two sides of the coin don't seem to be seen at once by the Labour Party, or they're not connected. And I just wonder, are there instances where that's been done elsewhere?
Yeah, because the worm at the heart of Labourism is the desire to have a single-party strong government, which means that you can't have proportional representation, because only without PR, only without people's vote can you hope on 35 or 40% of the vote to have an absolute parliamentary majority. So if that's your bet, if that's what you spent your life doing, then you can't even allow people to own their vote. And it's a dangerous myth of having this sort of one party, we'll take over the state, and then because we're the good people, we will do good things with the state. And what's undemocratic about that? But of course, what is undemocratic about that is that we're helpless. The rest of us are reduced to helplessness in the face of that project, and that isn't true of. Late social democratic parties are in deep trouble across the continent. But the reason why the Greens are doing well, for example, radical Green politics is doing well in Germany or in Austria now, luckily, is that they have a relatively proportional system. So you can vote for them. If we had proportion, this country would be much more radical with a PR system than without it. But I think there's a kind of a cultural question here, which is, we have this conversation, and I've had many such conversations, and you go away and you think, well, nobody really knows what the Constitution is here. And it matters whether you're in South Africa or in America or in Germany with the Basic Law. It's about something, and a very good constitutional commentator who's been very excellent on Brexit, he's rather neutral on whether it's very good on the whole Brexit process, David Allen Green, who writes in the FT, said, constitution should be boring. And ours is now very exciting, but this is a mad thing. And that's wrong. And what's wrong about that is that constitutions do three things. They set that they are overall the rules that govern how the rules are made. Okay. And then one lot of those rules that they govern is the different systems of power. What power does local government have? Your point about potholes. What power does the House of Second Chamber, the House of Lords? Who can overrule who? What power do judges have or not have? So that's one aspect of the Constitution. And the second aspect of the Constitution, it sets out what our rights are. Do we have the right to vote? Do we have the right to freedom of speech? Do we have the right to freedom to organise? Do we have the right to information? So there's a sense in which what are our rights as, and there's a third aspect, which is what kind of country are we? what should we aspire to be? What are we about? And the reason, America, that doesn't have to be in the document. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is the aspiration of the American Constitution, leaving slavery aside, that's its aspiration, is in the Declaration of Independence. But it is a constitutional value. And the basic law there in Germany is we're not going to be fascist
Yes,
again. And in South Africa, as we put apartheid behind us, so it doesn't matter how dreamy or how sort of unrealised the aspirations are, they give meaning to the country as a whole. Now, this country is where you go back to the history, because we were the first mover. We didn't have to aspire. Everybody else, the Chinese, the Indians, the French, the Germans, the Americans, they all fought us, right? We fought them for their independence, and therefore had to decide what kind of country we were. And we didn't bother with things like that because people were aspiring to be like us. We were there first. We were the Google, if you like, of search engines. So, and that thing of, well, it's not really for us. We don't need to be English or be anything because we have the English language. That goes back to that initial, indeed imperial founding moment, which had a world transformative impact. And so in Victorian times, we knew who we were. And a sense, one of the things that the Labour Party did coming out of the war, with under the sort of hegemony, the image of Churchill that was Attlee's government, they worked together, they were linked by wartime experience, this is something David Edgerton has sort of shown in his recent history. They produced a British nation. It was the National Health Service, it was the nationalisations. They tried to forge a mixture of Britain and, which again, that's sort of, we knew who we were, so we didn't have to think about those issues. And that's collapsed like a balloon. And it's had two impacts. One is with Brexit, both sides, both the traditional Remain side and the Boris Johnsonian Farage side, believe in Britain. That's what sort of Britain should we be? One kind of Britain says we could be Britain, the Blairite Britain, in the European Union, therefore we don't need to worry about everything else. The other one said, no, the only way Britain is incompatible with the European Union, we've got to be a world power. So it's kind of British nationalism, driven by the English, but it's a British nationalism. And we have to rethink those aspirations. And the way of putting this in terms of the Constitution is, if you want a very simple image, is this. If you think of the Constitution as a great bus or a coach, so it used to be with magnificent horses, and then it was sort of transformed into kind of Rolls-Royce types, but big with leather, and then it became a kind of modern bus, right? And now we have the current bus. Now, how the bus works, how the wheels, how the gearing works, of course, that needs specialists, and you don't want that to be interesting. But who owns the bus, and where the bus is going, that matters to us who are the passengers. Is it our bus, or does it belong to them? Are we in this bus because somebody's given us permission and they can chuck us out, or are we there by right? And if so, where is our documentation? We can claim that right. And those questions, you don't go into a garage and say to the mechanic, where should I go? You don't go in and say, who owns this vehicle? Right?
But I want it to run.
You don't need to know constitutional law, right? To know that those issues really matter. And as this is your life, as this is the vehicle taking you on the journey of your political existence, it matters a lot. And that's the constitutional argument which has been suppressed. And now Brexit it's brought it out, but nobody wants to have it.
Yeah. I mean, several things I want to pick up on, but the first one, or the one that's sort of most striking about the examples, so obviously Germany, obviously South Africa, India as well.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, the constitutional moments come about at a point in which a nation is being refounded in some really, really fundamental way. right? I think that's inarguable in South Africa. I think that's certainly inarguable in Germany. There's some catastrophe or there's some major political change at which there's a very clear point of terminus. The order that went before is no longer sustainable. It's lost all legitimacy. It's got to be remade in some fundamental way. What I guess is sort of a problem in Britain, certainly, is that moment feels like, on one level it feels like it kind of should be arriving at the moment, right? There's obviously something very, very unsustainable about the situation we're in now, right? That the tensions are building to a point. But at the same time, there's this huge investment in, the sort of, because one of the things that's so striking about constitutional commentators at the moment is that they're in some sense very intellectually conservative. Right? A small c conservative. I don't mean that they're allied to the Tory party. I mean that they have a kind of regard for what we have.
They're the mechanics of the bus.
Yeah. But that then becomes a sort of value statement about the bus itself.
It does. We have to take that back. That's the
but in the absence of a catastrophe of some kind, how do we get to the point where those conversations can be had?
Well, a glib answer is we have a velvet revolution. I mean, are you a revolutionary, or are you willing to sort of die for the monarchy?
I'm absolutely a revolutionary.
Fine, but you're not a Leninist vanguardist over the top.
No,
right?
no.
Okay, so there's somewhere in between, right? Which if you look at Roger Hallam's, the new common sense, that fantastic come out of Extinction Rebellion, but the system, and there's an interesting passage there about repression. Everybody says, we've got to do something about climate change, and then they subsidise fossil fuels. What's going on? So everybody says, oh yes, we've got an English question, the constitution doesn't work, it's broken. And you say, well, but we've got to keep PR for the next, we've got to keep non-having PR, we've got to carry on. Which is in the Labour Party, not just in the Tory Party. In fact, it's less in the Conservative Party, who are saying, right, roll up our sleeves, smash the judges, And so we're in a moment. Just look, we have the Tory party saying we're going to politicise the judiciary. Right? We are in a constitutional revolution, and if you're in a constitutional revolution and the left won't talk about it, well, I can tell you who's not going to win. Right? I can, it's just game over. So this is our moment, and that's not a call for barricades. Because we know what the police will do to barricades, right? And that's what's a call for a non-violent transformation. Yes, but it's essential if you want to end austerity, if you want to have the kind of John MacDonald economic democracy which he's argued for, then it won't be delivered by the existing British state. Right? And if there is still a kind of semi-Stalinist labourist myth that we'll get into the state, and then we will deliver, right, like Attlee, everything that's good for you, and you will be the recipients of it. And that doesn't work, and it won't work, and we're in a network digital age, and we're also in an age where people's economic expectations and their sense of their economic capacity and power is much, much greater than that, and their education, thank goodness for that. So we're in an age where people are capable of being democratic citizens.
Well, I think the way to read the Labour position charitably, although I think I agree with you that it's sort of a mistake, is that by accident we have what is effectively a pretty powerful parliament, and the Labour Party, if it had a majority in parliament, could do wonderful things to transform the country, much like Thatcher transformed the country using what is effectively an elective dictatorship. I suspect that there's not an equality of arms here, right? That the permanent British state, is much more amenable to transformation from the right than it is from the left.
No, you said it. But also, this British state, if you're going to have elective dictatorship, as you put it rightly, you've got to have the press on your side. If you're only capable of getting, as Blair did in his third term of office, 35% of the popular vote, then you have to have other institutions which are supporting the project in your sense of direction, or they will just take you to the cleaners. If you give Murdoch and the Sun the democratic ticket, right, with all the capital that they've got, then they're going to run over you.
I suppose the other thing I wanted to pick up was, we talked a bit about how there hasn't been much sense of kind of constitutional questions from the left during, let's take the kind of post-crisis period, right? So post-2008. I think there has been one place in Britain where it has happened, certainly to some degree, which was during the independence referendum in Scotland. Now, I think this probably links into some of the stuff you've been talking about, the relationship between the sort of repressed English nationalism, the way it drives British nationalism. But what do you make of the kind of conversations that were going on in Scotland at the time? Are they somewhere to look, the kind of conversations that we should be having?
Yes, and they're moving towards thinking about how to have their own constitution, and therefore creating a citizens' assembly. How is that independent? A citizens' assembly that's brought together by lots, representative. How do you draw on the Irish experience and the Icelandic experience to start doing that? This is something which is completely new in the last 15 years. Under Charter 88 was a sort of an attempt to to sort of deliver a bourgeois revolution, if you like, a bourgeois democracy, European style, state-centred democracy, and we've now completely moved on from that. I think there's something I'd like to confess here, which is that I played a part in the breakdown with Charter 88, and I think that one of the things that we've inherited, and why you can ask this question about Scotland, is that we've inherited a disintegration of the old regime, but not its replacement. And that disintegration, so what was there, to put it very, very, very briefly, 1988, zenith of Margaret Thatcher, Lawson boom. Labour Party had just previously catastrophically lost the election under Kinnock, it seemed completely aimless. The beginnings of modernisation, we had to be able to respond to this. And we said, look, we need to have a democratic constitution. We were in a very amusing letter, which we wrote from Charter 88 to Margaret Thatcher, who wrote back saying we don't need to have a democratic constitution. Right, so a programme is developed which includes Scottish and Welsh parliaments, includes a Bill of Rights, Human Rights Act, includes the Freedom of Information Act, which you didn't have. It includes a call for PR, it calls for abolishing aristocratic control of the House of Lords and so on, to be summed up in a written constitution. John Smith, when he succeeds after they lose the 92 election, goes to talk to some nurses in a constituency, I think in Brighton, and mentions human rights, and they all applaud. And he decides, he's pro-European, that now is the time. And he comes to Charter 88, thanks to his chief of staff, David Ward. He was a man of the right, right? But he pushed out, he took a big risk, and he gave a Charter 88 lecture, and he committed the Labour Party not to a written constitution, but to a formula effectively developed by Gordon Brown, who had also given a Charter 88 sovereignty lecture, which was a new constitutional settlement. So they understood, both of them, both Scots, that to go for these kind of radical reforms, they had to reform the totality. When Smith died and Blair took over, he decided that he had to deliver on the discrete items, but he refused to deliver an overall transformation. And the result of this was that he broke the old system. They chopped out the aristocrats, right? He sort of, was contemptuous of Scotland, thought it was like a parish council, but he had to deliver it. They delivered eventually a Freedom of Information Act. They had a Human Rights Act. And each one of these pieces of legislation, and it shows you why we're a constitutional country, worked. Right? Freedom of Information Act delivered the expenses scandal.
Yes,
exposed the MP. The Scottish, there was a half-hearted thing in Wales, which was where the referendum for a Welsh assembly was won by sort of 0.5%. But now, for the first time in 600 years, there are Welsh laws, right? That assembly is deeply part of Welsh life. So Wales worked, the Good Friday Agreement, which was wonderful, that worked, right? The Freedom of Information worked, the Bill of Rights in its own way, now we have a Supreme Court. So each of these elements, people got hold of it, they said, this is real power, it's not about consultation, let's get going. And of course, the totality, the overall, disintegrated. And I lobbied them. I said, it was very, very painful. I was no longer on Charter 88. I lobbied Blair personally. I wrote a very sort of tough memorandum to him. His chief of staff, Jonathan Powell, rang and said, this is a good memo, you must go and see Derry Irvine, the Lord Chancellor. And he said to me on the phone, summing up my argument, after us the deluge, right? And we're living in the deluge. So we're living in a situation where these specific reforms which have empowered people are now motoring, the judges, Scotland, you name it, freedom of information, widely used. But what does it all add up to? What is it? It's not the old, we don't have the old constitution.
Yeah.
The right are driving into this vacuum, the deluge, if you like, to try and make sense of it by taking us back to global Britain. And we have to face up to that. And the problem we've got in Brexit, sorry, I'm rattling on. The problem we've got in Brexit is that a lot of the opposition to it around the people's vote is still being overseen by Alistair Campbell, by Tony Blair, by Peter Mandelson, who were responsible for that disintegration. And for them, they felt they want to take us back.
Yes, the party of the status quo ante, right?
Back to remain. God, what a terrible slogan that is. And to Cameron, And so, we had to vote Remain because we're pro-Europeans, but and it doesn't represent an alternative. And the Labour Party has looked at this. Sorry, can I just rattle out? The Labour Party looked at it, and they've said, and this is why when you're talking about these issues, you don't want to think logically. You want to think in terms of what is our project and what is this about. And John McDonnell on the radio recently on Today programme made the best possible defence of the Labour Party policy, which is it's very logical. Okay, you want to have a Labour government, right? We have a Labour government. We've got this terrible Brexit business, and obviously we've got to take it back to the people. So we have to have a referendum. Fine. If you're going to have a referendum, then one option is to remain. Well, that's the right of the Labour Party. But then there's going to be another option to not remain. But we want a Labour government. So the other option to leave has got to be a Brexit which is acceptable to the Labour Party. That's not Theresa May's deal because we're not in the customs union. It's bad for business. It's bad for jobs. So we've got to renegotiate to have a good deal, which we can deliver if that's what the people choose. So we have a Brexit that's acceptable to the Labour Party and a Remain that's acceptable to the Labour Party, and we put the option to the people, and that's a logical thing. You look at it and you think, yeah, but it isn't what Brexit means to Brexiteers, and it's crazy, right? Going in a whole negotiation, and then you're going to have a referendum, and then you might be against the deal that you've negotiated. And, you're not talking about what's happening.
Yeah.
And the problem is that their starting point is we have a Labour government in charge, right? And the starting point's got to be what kind of country are we? What direction are we going in? What, are we a European country or not? And that's got to be addressed. The party has to address the question. The question is primary, and they treat it as tactical, as secondary. And that's because they think that the constitutional issue, what kind of country are we? Should we be in control? These are tactical issues. They don't matter on the doorstep. And of course they do. So they're trapped in their incapacities. That's why I want to make this clear. And I want to say to people, it's not a dry, dusty thing, right? This is actually the heart of it. And this is the final point to get back to your question on Scotland, which is one of the ways in which, because the Scottish thing worked, so while the Scottish government, and there's a big Scottish Remain movement for Remain, they're not for going back, right? Remain in Scotland is to be, for Scotland, one way or another, to be a European country. It is to make the democratic revolution that was started but broken by Labour function. So the SNP has much too much, from what I can see, it's too Westminster-centric model. It's too centralised, and in that sense, it's part of the old order, if you like, but it's not part of the old British state, and therefore it's not for return, and therefore it has a sense of the future attached to it. and that's why that kind of progressive politics in Scotland is working.
It's intriguing to me, this sense, because from what you're saying, and I think I agree that so the way in which people often treat Brexit is that it fundamentally arises from some sort of conflict between, you know, British democracy and its integration or failure of integration into, you know, a wider constitutional order in Europe, right? So it's the conflict is on a national and international level. And what you're suggesting, and I think it's, you know, plausible, is that it actually emanates from, you know, it's much like if you put a brick in a washing machine, it will eventually spin itself apart, right? So it's actually something that's come from this, you know, this question within the state itself, within the British state itself, with its relation, you know, both to the nations and to its people. But what this then
because Brexit is a breakdown. Brexit is not a rational, instrumental relationship to the EU. It's based on this myth that the EU is a colonial power. You know, I mean, the EU is generating new forms of sovereignty and shared sovereignty, especially around regulation, which the UK helped to pioneer, and which are really rather wonderful, from freedom of movement to workers, to work conditions, and to the safety of our food and medicine. And they can't be dealt with in the normal tripartite structure of the old forms of state power. But, you know, Germany and France, and, you know, they're not ruled by, so nor are we. So there's a mythical, why does it have such power? It's because there's a breakdown taking place. Brexit's our problem.
Right, so then the question then has to be about, and I think also, you know, I think your account, the Labour Party, the institutional restoration to this, it's pretty clearly, you know, it's the kind of quandary they don't want to have to deal with, right? They're actually, they're a party of the British state, and they think of themselves as a, you know, regardless of actually Labour's kind of gradual collapse in Scotland, you know, still think of themselves as a kind of gradual, very sudden. Well, yeah, but I think it was coming for a long time. It was hollowed out for a long time under Blair, who, you know, as you say, treated Scotland rather as an afterthought. So I think there's a consequence there. It's been a gradual hollowing out, and then, you know, collapsed very suddenly. But then the question becomes, and I think this is something that we should move on to. The question then becomes actually how you deal with it, right? And so you've written a bit, I think, about sort of, you know, how you would figure out how you make a new constitution, or a new constitutional settlement, as it were, in Britain. And you know, as I've said, one of the things that makes me kind of anxious at the moment is you have, you know, what is essentially this kind of huge political thunderstorm. The clouds are getting darker and darker, and you can hear the occasional rumble. The heavens haven't quite opened yet, but it's like you can feel the tension in the air, and you just think it's very clear politically that it's not sustainable for much longer. Yeah. And so the question then becomes, you know, how are these things solvable? Well, they don't seem solvable actually through the normal mechanisms of a general election. I think we write about that as well. We talk about constitutions as the law which stands behind the law. So there has to be a kind of extraordinary process to deal with them. In the case of sort of 18th century constitutional formations, those were, you know, declarations of independence, wars, things like that, where you had, you know, fundamentally a new moment at which, you know, in the case of the United States, a relatively small number of people could have learned and, you know, phenomenal arguments about what kind of thing a state should be. We live in a fundamentally different era. It's not the 18th century. We have, you know, very good things, you know, mass suffrage, the franchise. These things are important. So the question of democratic consultation seems to me to be key to how you would get to that constitutional moment. But it also seems a lot messier than you would have when you had just a sort of bunch of men sitting around a table figuring out how they wanted to run a nation.
So I think, first of all, there's a slight myth there that there's different things. One we can draw on if we want to. You made this, I think it was a tweet about Cook, you know, and not just the levellers in the Civil War. And we have a tradition in this country of, it's quite a deep one. I say tradition, not quite the right word. Everybody knows that when the king overstepped the mark, we chopped off his head. So there is this element here of, it was very striking to me once. I was watching a television programme about Naseby, what was that, 20 years ago, and there was a discussion in a pub, and the guy said, when we ended divine right, and he pointed at, we ended divine right then, and it's this thing. It wasn't said in any. I don't know whether he was conservative or Labour or even radical. It was like, there's a limit that we're not going to be pushed. So there's a very powerful sense that we have a constitutional tradition here, and there's a sort of radical version, if you like, perhaps a pre-industrial one going right the way through to Shelley, and we have that to draw on. So it's not as if it's like, oh my God, we've got to be like the French or something like that, or we've got to suddenly we're going to be Americans. We have our own revolutionary constitutional political traditions, which are there. Secondly, most constitutional and political revolutions in the recent period have been peaceful. So you haven't mentioned Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
But, and they have been peaceful in part because they've been about joining a larger union which provides an international framework of human rights law. Now we contest, and I would contest, some of the ways that those laws have been used to underwrite neoliberalism, to underwrite the market. But because it is a political space, unlike the British one, it's much easier to reverse that than it is to try and get your hands on the City of London. Right? I mean, that's the myth. We can deal with the City of London. The European Union is this great. The European Union is a very fragile, constantly changing, and it would only need 3 or 4 large European countries to say we're not going on like this. We're changing our rule framework to be like this. Then that would change. It's in the hands of the national political. So. And so those are countries that have gone through, you could say, well, the collapse of the Soviet Union was a dramatic moment. Well, we're going through a dramatic moment, right? So, if we try to do it with our neighbours in a larger context, then that drama is one which, well, it goes deep and will hurt, will feel, is quite relatively easily done. So to take an example, in Scotland, if Brexit happens, if Boris Johnson's insane no deal goes through, or even if there is a rather brutal deal and agreement over Ireland goes through, you can imagine the European Union saying to Scotland, well, we don't want you to leave, you voted 65% to stay, if you want to be independent, these are the conditions. So you can have an independence referendum, which isn't then, we'll have an independence referendum and then join the European Union. It's no, if you want one, these are the terms, these are the generous terms that we would offer you. Continuity, Cameron deal, ever closer union, doesn't have to apply to you, things like that. And they would have a convention process of some kind to discuss and debate that, and then they would have a referendum emerging out of that, so combining deliberation and decision making. And you can imagine that quite easily, right? It would be very painful down here because this would make us English, whether we wanted it or not, right? So it would be, but they could do that. And if it goes on like that, personally, I think they should do it. I think this is the way that then we in England will face up to ourselves, become normal. And it doesn't fill me with fear, right? What fills me with fear is the blockage, right? Fills me with fear is the left feeling righteous and screwed as it is, and feeling it's on the side of the people, which it is, and then going into a conflict, repressing these questions, because then it's going in to lose, right? And that fills me with fear. And the kind of repression that will then follow, sort of, a triumph of Farageism, if you like, that's the real danger. And the danger is I'm not taking the initiative on these issues. That's what is much more likely to lead to bloodshed and to a disintegrative violence than to a full showdown with the British institutions, which of course we're a mature, intelligent country, very, very intelligent. We've got lots of access to this culture. And you haven't mentioned the internet, but this is a digital age. This has transformed our capacity. I'm sure one reason why the whole idea of citizens' assemblies appears to be legitimate now, immediately and instinctively legitimate, which it wouldn't have done 20 or 30 years ago, is it can be live streamed, right? So as in art, so they can be watched. you can see what's happening. You can see this process. You can listen to the experts that they hear. You can trace you can watch a small conversation to make sure that everybody's engaged. So the process is also transparently available to us. It's not locked away.
I mean, you mentioned there just earlier. As I'm sure you know, I think a lot about the English Civil War and its aftermath. The moment at which we did, there was that kind of ultimate popular veto, as it were, over tyranny, as they put it then. And John Cook, huge figure for me, was the prosecutor.
Yes, you say who he is.
Yeah, I mean, he was the prosecutor.
He ought to be,
real
John Cook,
ought to be, the left is often very interested in sort of, radicals of the English Civil War and the aftermath of the English Civil War. Diggers, Levellers, Winstanley. All of these people very, very much worthwhile and very important. John Cook gets less of a look in, but this is a guy who is, convinced Puritan. Thought very deeply about the relation of law to politics, poor people's access to the law, the relation of the law to tyranny, and had to effectively come up with a law governing tyranny in order to conduct the prosecution of Charles I. Had to help effectively invent a court to try a king. Really, really important figure. So there is this long tradition in the country about...
There's this story about him, I don't know if it's true, that the king said, you must be quiet,
yes.
and he wouldn't be quiet. And then the king hit him with his cane, and the silver top of the cane fell off, and the king said, pick it up, and he wouldn't.
Yeah.
And the king had to bend, and this moment is taken as the kind of symbol of the subordination of the monarchy to law in our political culture. And the reason I think, I know much more about it than I do because I'm not an expert in spirit at all, but I think one of the reasons why there's a resistance on the left to celebrating him is he was a lawyer.
Yeah.
Right? And underneath that, there's a kind of lazy Marxism which says, the law is just a function of economics. What matters is economics, and the law is a superstructure, secondary. And so in this process, there's, if you like, a deeper argument with traditional Marxism, which is saying that the core governing values in culture has a formative shaping force over the economy. It's not simply a secondary issue. Put the good guys in charge, and that doesn't matter. And so he represents that kind of he's not easily assimilated, if you like, to a sort of a Marxist leftist, maybe because he wasn't one of us.
No.
From that point of view, right? He wasn't an advocate of. He was a prosecutor, and so he argued, as I understand, the autonomy of the law.
Yeah.
And that's it. It's important in its access, and that's, of course, a profound constitutional value.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, actually, and to identify some of the hesitancies on the left about this do emerge from this sense that actually all questions of state ordering are fundamentally secondary and largely a consequence of fundamental acts of economic justice. And yes, it does actually alter the way in which we read our political history. So the diggers and levellers, we understand that they're in a fight over land and sustenance and stuff like that. It's hugely, hugely important. But there's another thing going on at the time, and I think, yes, it's really important to retain it. Just then, let's look forward, right, and think about. So we talked a bit about sort of citizens' assemblies or citizens' juries and things like that, and these, the idea that these might be, pretty, are going to have to be involved in remaking the constitutional order in some way. And I think that's true.
Well, I think the way to put it is there has to be deliberation. But this is something we can think about, and we want people like us to have those arguments and to visibly think this process through in a way that we could if we had the time, or we could follow it. And that therefore we're looking for a politics based on thought and argument and deliberation, and everybody can understand how the jury works, And it's that process which we want. No, not another bloody assembly, right? Which is the way we do it. Not another layer of government, which is the way the kind of your Brexiteers will mock it, right? To say no, this is about taking control, but control is a complicated process. So we need to be able to do some thinking, watch that process going on. And I think that analogy reminds me of another point which I'd like to make about Brexit, because I think it's really, really important one about what the confusion here, and it's confusion which your sort of left supporters of Brexit, sort of a bit Arabistani and all that sort of soft, you're not sure, a bit ashamed now to see that it's intrinsically right wing, but sort of clinging on, is this, that the way I think we've got to look at the question is this: how do we attack and condemn the call for Brexit from millions of people who thought this is a way of taking back control? How are we not snobs or like Alistair Campbell, whatever it is? And the answer is this: if you want to criticise a criminal has been sent to jail, there are two aspects to what's happened. And one is, are they innocent or guilty? And the other is the sentence appropriate? Should they have gone into community service and they've been given 20 years, right? Should they never have been given 20 years because it was only worth 6 months, right? Or a fine. And that's a huge issue of justice. Now, if you look at the Brexit decision as having two aspects, one is, here is the British ruling class. It is top-down, elitist, undemocratic, manipulative, and taking our power away from us. Guilty as charged, right? And a lot of the Brexit impulse was, this is no way to run. We've got our own back on London and North. This is no way to run a country. And sentence, leave the European Union. Well, I'm sorry, it's going to make it worse, right? It will actually make what you have condemned worse, not better. It will not empower us. And the sentence is, we were given this choice, and leave didn't mean anything, because it was leave being Norway or leave, a hard deal or what. It was like, we're going to go out the door, but are you going to a nice warm pub next door, or are you going out into the rain without an umbrella? The invitation to leave is different, right?
Yeah.
And that was left completely open, so it wasn't clear what people were voting for, but what was clear, what they were voting against. And so there was a guilty verdict, and we have to say yes. So I think the Caroline Lucas thing, I've been working with Caroline, so I'm not in the Green Party, but I think she's an outstanding political figure, and she's got that right. It gave the establishment a deserved kicking, right? But the verdict, the actual sentence that it delivered, the verdict was fine, but the sentence is completely inappropriate and indeed will boomerang. It's not.
Yeah, but the question here, and I think it's as much a question about how you would make these things function with consent, is that I pretty much agree with that analysis. I agree that those are the motive forces out there. There are a lot of people in the country saying, we are the people who are never listened to. That the people who run the country ignore what we have to say, and now they're doing it again, right? That we won this vote, and now they're fobbing us off with, So in this situation, now they're going to fob us off with this kind of constitutional process. We voted to leave, and the problem here, I think, or the thing that's difficult to disentangle. I honestly don't know. I hope it is, but I don't know whether it's politically possible. Is to separate out that impulse, as you say, the guilty verdict from the sentencing. Whether it's possible to separate them, because they've now become so identified that the vote was not just about actually kicking the political class, but it was a vote to leave, right? And this you see this in the polling, right? That people who were previously kind of very soft Brexiters are now kind of moved to this very hard no-deal position. And so I wonder, is there a way? Is there something in this process? Is there something where you think about how you gain consent Because I think,
Yeah, but I think there is, and obviously I've thought about this a lot, and I've watched Caroline wrestling with this very question, and I think I'm confident the answer is this: that what's happened. So what's happened with people's voting and their positions, I think, is that even if in the last few days it were very uncertain, as millions were, they took an executive decision. And having taken it, they're sticking with it. Because I took a decision, right? And if you voted Remain, you've been completely justified in your view. And the Brexiteers haven't in any way reached out to recognise the Remain side. They have failed to gain consent. And if you've gone for Brexit, what's happened to it? Why haven't they delivered it? What all that? And if you want to make the separation that we just, we sort of seem to agree on, the problem is it can only be made by a political party. So if you stand up as an individual and say we want to have another referendum with sort of the same question, how do you make it clear that to vote for Remain is not a vote to return to the past? Right? If you're you or me, right, or Caroline Lucas at this moment, how do you do that? You can only do that if you're a political party. If you're the Labour Party and you're saying, vote Remain, it will bring you control like this, and this is, we really mean it, and these guys are pulling a fast one, that has credibility, because you have to be in government to do that. And part of the lure of the Brexit vote was there was an easy answer. We can leave, right? I don't mind whether it's a warm pub or a wet day or what you're wearing, or if you're naked in the snow, it's leave, right? Everybody can see this is absurd, right? And everybody can see it's desperate. And it'll be all right? We can go out naked into the snow, we'll be fine, right? Just like the American Revolutionary Independence. Everybody can sense there's something. It's not. Let's see if that will work. If it happens, it better work. And that isn't, because it's a profoundly opportunist and populist in the bad sense piece of sloganeering. It doesn't need to be a serious act of government. And we have to be better than that. That's, you might say it's unfair, if you're going to be on the left, you can't complain that the odds are stacked against you. That, is that surprise, right? But so we have to present a Remain in a programmatic fashion. And it's very difficult to do that if you say, let's have another referendum. It's got to be done by a force that can deliver something programmatic. And that's where the Scottish example comes back in, because when the Scottish government says you want to remain, it's a government that will govern in Europe that will become more Scottish by being, it would be like the Irish example, they will feel more Scottish, they will feel enhanced by their nationalism will be high. You kind of understand what Remain is about. It's not just going back to the past. It's not going back to the mess of Cameron.
Let's just talk, just because I want to also have just a sense of what the future looks like,
right,
in the most optimistic world. Because the left is very good at pessimism, right? The left is very good at pessimism. I'm very good at pessimism. I can outline the really dreadful ways in which everything's going to go horribly wrong. But let's think, just from your perspective. So I know you've thought for a long time about this stuff, and just what actually, I'm not sure you need to talk about final outcomes, but what a new constitutional order would look like. Because as you said, we had the kind of Blair, rather abortive attempt to do bits and pieces, but not actually look at the whole.
The bits and pieces were done well. But the Because by destroying it, he took the elected dictatorship of Thatcher, which at least had certain checks and balances, stripped off the checks and balances, including cabinet government. Without which,
not often remarked on, but actually really
deeply violent, which was done secretly at the time. We didn't know, but I could say something about the cabinet government if you want. Collapse of cabinet government, just because this gives you a sense of how bad things are. So we have a system which fuses legislative and executive power and keeps the judiciary at arm's length. And it does so because the executive body, the cabinet, is drawn from the legislature. So that's what Bagehot said in the middle of the 19th century was unique about the English constitution, therefore made it much better than the American constitution. And then on top of that, you have the decoration, the decorative thing of the monarchy. Everybody is looking at the decoration, but these guys are doing the business. And the cabinet is a kind of, the idea of the cabinet is that while the Prime Minister, the Queen's First Minister, is primus inter pares, is the First Minister, it is still a collective body, and therefore there's a degree of collective wisdom of holding executive power because it is embedded in the legislature and the elected. So that notion is quite an important one for the way in which it functioned. Now, it did break down with Suez. It's not a perfect system by any means, and it is a whole load of mostly men, and they're still fixing things. But nonetheless, there was a kind of institutional wisdom built into it. What Blair did, and then this has been documented by David Owen, was he, and I've heard this at first hand, he went into his first cabinet meeting and two ministers raised questions about his policy. And this is something that happened under Thatcher. I mean, we know that Ken Clarke posed the question of what her mad policy on German unification. It was raised in cabinet, it was discussed in cabinet, and she was forced to change her policy. So Blair summons Jonathan Powell and Robin Butler, who was the cabinet secretary and head of the civil service. And he says to these two men, what's going on? And Robin Butler says to him, we have cabinet government, Prime Minister. And Blair shakes his head, right, and says it's never to happen again. Nobody is to raise a question in cabinet that hasn't been cleared previously. And that breaks the cabinet as it becomes, therefore, a body that assesses policy decisions that have already been made. They're presented.
Rather than a kind of actual
it's a
forum.
Small group, like a group, it's a presentation group, right? It's no longer a group, it's no longer an executive
really
body.
Bad seminar.
Right? And then, and this is only Owen documents, he brought the Cabinet Office into number 10. So they weren't getting their own papers, which is why the Cabinet never got the legal papers, right, for the Iraq War. They weren't independent of it, they were all being supplied. So the Iraq War wouldn't have happened certainly the way it did, had there been cabinet government. And if you fast forward, so the referendum, colossal historic decision, never discussed by cabinet. Because the cabinet was a coalition, it was a party political decision, goes into the party manifesto, the party wins the majority, that's it. It's never, what you do about it was never discussed. We could take so if you think, well, what difference does that make? Well, here's an example. If Cameron had come back with the kind of deal he wanted to negotiate with the European Union and had a real debate with Michael Gove, and I think Johnson wasn't in the cabinet at that point, but Gove would have been, and Gove was critical to turning Johnson against it, he would have known what Gove's view was. He would have known what was going to happen. And that split was crucial because Farage would never have won a referendum on his own. It was the split of the leadership of the Tory party which was decisive. And Gove then wrote a very eloquent argument explaining why, 1,500 word thing, and then Johnson, who was a bit of a follower, then followed by saying he was going to follow that. And so the inability to actually really say to people around the table, well, where do you stand on this? Why do you stand? Have that argument as an argument of an executive group. Its absence, you could argue, led
exacerbates fractures within
a
party.
Yes, and then you get. So when you have Theresa May's disastrous Article 50 letter, with its red lines and so on, sent off, it was written by Nick Timothy, whatever, apparently, and the cabinet were called in to be told what was in it after it had been given to our ambassador to the EU to deliver. And they said, well, we don't want it to leak, right? So you can't trust your cabinet, and it's gone. And then when the Chequers thing, when she comes back with the Chequers agreement, so the cabinet is summoned in to Chequers, and then they're there, and they're told, here is the agreement, this is the document. If you want to resign, it's a long walk to the gate, and you have to get in your own taxi, otherwise you can't use a government car. Now, I was talking to a very experienced businessman who's been the chair of, FTSE 100 companies, and I said, would you be a board member of a company, right, where the papers, right, of a major decision that you were to take were not given to you in advance? Right? Yeah. And he just said, you couldn't do that. It's inconceivable that a non-executive or a director you couldn't take responsibility. You would resign. You would either resign or you'd throw out the chairman. I mean, you can't run a responsible organisation like that. So the core mechanism of but bringing legislative and executive power together, which is at the heart of what was the British Constitution, it's been shattered. And nobody thinks it's, within cabinet government, say, cabinet, who are these people, they're all... But it's a sign of the kind of autocracy that we've got. And also, these kinds of autocracy are very vulnerable. And you see it, everybody's going on about Dominic Cummings. This is a appointed person. Who is this figure? It's just like, and he's bossing them all around and firing their staff. This is an end. The end is an end of the system. This is not a system of health.
So let me sort of, because I can see,
Sorry, I haven't answered.
No. But this is actually a way into the answer because
we can't go on being
right. But your critique of the kind of collapse of cabinet government into this sort of incredibly autocratic system of not really even prime ministerial government. Yeah. Incredibly autocratic system of government.
Fed by the media. The media loves it.
But your criticism here is, I think, leads into let's imagine there was this consultative citizens' assembly tomorrow. Right. You were asked to give evidence or give a proposal to them. And I get the sense that what you deplore about the collapse of cabinet government is this sense of kind of deliberative assembly, this deliberative and consultative committee. What else would you feed into that assembly about the way they should re-envision the structure of politics in Britain?
Well, I think I would start by saying that local governments must be able to raise their own funds and be properly empowered to have their funds, so that the whole sense where I don't mean that with Manchester or Birmingham, the sense that these places they depend upon even to feed people or their social services on handouts from the centre state. They're not allowed to raise their own money. So I think that one of the first things you would consider is how can we ensure that there is a fair, equitable and self-owned funding of the practical aspects of government that everybody can understand. So that if Birmingham wants to become Birmingham and have a Birmingham policy and can fund it and borrow money and it actually has got that capacity, and that your democracy where it can counts, and that process, which I think should include referendums, is one where you have the rules for doing it, so that if you want a referendum, you've got to you can't just pull them out of the hat. They've got their rules for doing it. There's going to be planning. There's going to be process. So everybody say, my city belongs to me. And if you want to create, people say, well, what about the regions? Why don't we have regions and all this? And then they want to draw up plans in the middle, like come in and tell us what you think the regions should be. Whereas I think we should say to people, look, if you're in Yorkshire and you want to combine, you have the power to do so. Right? This is, if you want to draw a border in Germany, the Länder can the German regions, the borders of those regions, though they don't have national referendum, can be decided by the people who live in them. So one lot of people say, well, we don't want to live in this area, or doesn't matter. It's up to them, right? It's up to them. So it would be up to the people of Northern Ireland whether they wanted the backstop or not, right? If they wanted to stay in they could, right? Because the central state is no longer saying this is one country and one sovereignty and who do you think you are? And I think people can understand that, and I think that's one of the most important ways of saying where there are decisions that you know about and you can understand, you take them.
Mm-hmm.
And this ties particularly to things like roads and road development, and whether you have, the way in which roads are created here. Suddenly a decision is taken, it doesn't really go through Parliament even. It's just outrageous. It's just outrageous. And when people want to bypass, Boston, right, which voted nearly 80%, has been wanting a bypass for 25 years, right, and he can't get one. Right? It's just, and the sense of powerlessness over issues which people know they should have power over. So I think that the thing I would say to such a deliberative assembly, what should you be thinking about, is you want to think in those terms. You want to think not in terms of what's the policy, but what is the process which will allow people, the wisdom, intelligence, practicality of people, to be applied and to be effective. Because some of the important things about this country, people say it's a very conservative country. This is a country of most people live in suburbs, and most suburbs are about improvement, right? People love improvement, right? They love tools. They love, I'm sort of a bit myself, a bit of a sucker for hand tools, but they like changing things, they like improving things. This is not a country which is deeply stuck in the mud, and that's one of the dangers of the kind of Johnson rhetoric, is that they've focus group this, they understand this, and they're kind of exploiting that sense of frustration and desire. And so
it's about putting the tools back in people's hands.
Fine, you've got there are lots of then they say how, which tools are there. Yeah. So it's got so I think that would be that's a very important part of it. Then if you're looking at the Constitution, is the right of free health a constitutional right? Mm-hmm. The NHS has become, if you like, a constitution. And then do we have the right to honest news? Mm-hmm. Right? Do we have the right, to what extent as citizens do we have the right of access to this? So that you can think really creatively. And then there's a set of issues which are of fundamental importance now, which is the rights of the environment. And there's this kind of, if you like, Burkean paying issue of, well, what about the rights of the unborn? And how do we constitutionalise that? And how do you empower people to constitutionalise that so it's not another oppressive thing which is coming down there? And then I think I would have one element which I think is really important, because it goes back to the revolution, if I can put it like that, our revolution, which is how you articulate liberty. And here I would take kind of Quentin Skinner view that our liberty is lost, not just threatened, but lost, if somebody else's liberty is threatened. So that it's not a consumer, it's not a sort of negative freedom. It's if I'm okay, that's fine by me. No, we have, as a way, part of our constitutional values is to help others, is to be working with others. And that sense of how you articulate solidarity, so that it's not just, I'm worried about my privacy, but I'm also worried about your privacy and your right to that privacy, and how that is protected, so that we build in. I think there's quite a strong cultural sense here. People talk about fairness, though, about fairness. It's more than that, right? But it is a sense that we're here to help each other, and therefore the freedom of the other is part of our own freedom. And I think that's one of the things when you start to look at rights you would want to build in. So the process, if you can get out of the mindset with the Fabian mindset, that this is boring and not for you, and it's all bureaucratic, and it's all going to be, it's a fix. No, it's ending the fix, and it's opening up the ability to break the dependency of our state on big money and on dark money, and to be able to develop our own capacities, and that's the opportunity, and we have all the resources, and we now have the means of communication to do it, and we now have the political crisis which is calling for this solution. So if we can get our heads around constitutional questions, the constitution is linked to democracy is linked to the national question, to who we are, which is linked to the European question. They're all interlinked in a wonderful way, not in a oppressive or difficult way. Instinctively, they are linked. They feed each other, and that's the opportunity that's in front of us.
Well, I think that's a great place to end it on an optimistic note. Anthony, thank you so much.
Thank you, pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you.